So without any more, I'm going to introduce our guest speaker, attorney Richard Gifford from Little Compton.
I'll start with the art history section of my lecture, and we look at the painting, the Bierstadt painting of Martha Simon, which Bierstadt painted in the 1850s, and he entitled The Last of the Narragansetts. Of course, Martha Simon was not a Narragansett, but a Wampanoag. I saw this painting fairly recently, about 6 months or so ago, over at the Millicent Library in Fairhaven, and they sent it down to Yale to have it restored. And it's now almost completely black. I mean, you can't really even see anything. They have a photograph of the painting next to the painting so that you can see what's represented. This photograph, you'll see a lot more in it than you will by the actual original painting. Next. She was the last of the Native Americans in Fairhaven. Bierstadt's plan was to present that to Henry Huddleston Rogers, a very, very wealthy man, Standard Oil, Rockefeller, the whole bit, in hopes of, he wanted to sell him a device for a railway car. And although he claimed that I cannot afford to waste my time making money, which is a wonderful philosophy, I guess, but most of us can't afford to follow. Next. This is the area on Sconticut Neck where Martha Simon lived. It's titled here Indian Territory, and right above that is where she lived, M. Simon. I've seen even in histories of Fairhaven, they call where she lived a reservation, and that's not really true. When I was involved serendipitously, the only reason I found this, I was looking at early Delano deeds in Fairhaven in connection with the Delano family reunion this summer, and I found a deed in 1747 from Nathaniel Delano to John Simon, Indian man of Little Compton, who's the grandfather of Martha, and he purchased 12 acres of land on Sconticut Neck for 100 pounds. The witnesses on the deed were Perez Richmond and Ichabod Richmond, who both lived down in Acoxet, brothers, and the justice of the peace was Sylvester Richmond, and I'll get back to Perez Richmond in a minute. Next. This is from Thoreau. Thoreau went and interviewed Martha Simons. He called the only pure-blooded Indian left about New Bedford. She lived in a hut. The small tract of Indian land now wholly hers. It had been her grandfather's. I mean, it was never established as a reservation. It was just, on its face, a normal transaction. It was formally, meaning the land, was formally exchanged by a white man for some better land then occupied by Indians at Westport, which he, the white man, wanted. So said a Quaker minister, her neighbor. The truth of what happened is probably pretty close to that. I think, from what I've seen, that it was not really exchanged in the sense that John Simon didn't give a deed for any land in Westport, but he certainly lived down at Acoxet. And where he lived was part of the farm of Perez Richmond, who appears as a witness on this deed. And I think what happened was that Richmond put up the 100 pounds, the purchase price, for the land over at Sconticut Neck, with the understanding that if he bought it, Simon would move there and clear out of Acoxet so that he and his brother could take over what had been Indian-occupied land at the time. Next. She was at home when Thoreau called on her. A little hut, not so big as mine. Thoreau didn't live in a very big place himself. She was down by the seaside. She had half an acre of real tawny Indian face, broad with high cheekbones, black eyes, straight hair. originally black but a little gray parted in the middle. Her hands were several shades darker than her face. She had a peculiarly vacant expression, perhaps characteristic of the Indian, answered our questions listlessly, mostly monosyllables. Next. To judge from her appearance, she might have been King Philip's own daughter. Yet she could not speak a word of Indian and knew nothing of her race. Keep in mind that sentence. The first part of it, I'll be reading from testimony from people who were basically born about 1800, who were of Indian derivation, Native American ancestry, and who all say that they know, my great-grandmother could speak the language, or my grandmother, and being the last. So when you consider that they're born about 1800, you're talking about probably by the mid-1700s, where around here, the Wampanoags no longer spoke the language and knew nothing of her race. The other thing I find puzzling is that whenever you run across references like in the Earl Census, which was in 1860s, or in some of the documents that I'm going to read to you, all the people, the Wampanoags who lived around here are all called the Dartmouth Indians. Now, I have a hard time thinking that that's how they referred to themselves. And yet, I can't find any other term that they did use, and most of them, when talking about their own grandparents, great-grandparents, they knew where they lived, but there's a curious kind of absence of a tribal identity of their ancestors. They just say where they lived, and they don't have any term that's any better than Dartmouth Indians. So I'm still in search and in hope of finding how did they refer to themselves. She had lived up at Assawamsett. She'd done work up there. She said she was 60 years old, was probably near her 70. She sat with her elbows on her knees and facing her hands at a peculiar vacant stare, perhaps looking out the window, indifferent to their presence. Next. She was born on that spot. Her grandfather, John Simon, lived in the same land but in a different house. He was the last of her race who could speak Indian. And we'll find he was a minister. She heard him pray in Indian but could only understand the words Jesus Christ. Her only companion was a tortoiseshell cat, and there's a cat shown in the painting, stone chimney, with bricks in it, bed covered with dirty bedclothes. She hired out her field as a pasture, and which she considered a better alternative than to cultivate it herself, and there were young heifers in the pasture. Next. She was very knowledgeable about plants, and he had elytras. I don't even know what that is. I guess that's how you pronounce it. And says, that's husk root. It's good to put into bitters for a weak stomach. And there are several Wampanoags who lived in this area, even into the 1800s. Shalati White in Westport, and Ruth Cuffey, who was Paul Cuffey's niece up at Watuppa Reservation, who were sort of Indian doctors. They practiced what we might call herbal medicine. And a lot of the modern pharmacology has found that there's quite a bit of merit in some of these old herbal remedies. She had, I don't know who the neighbor was, but she had a conceited old Quaker minister who was her neighbor, who told Thoreau, I think that the Indians were human beings, thus do not think so. He only convinced me of his doubt and narrowness. Next. This is an area, Russell's Mills, up here. And this area right down here, that's S. Barker's, Samuel Barker, which is 255 Horseneck Road, a house that's been torn down. I think it's either on or just north of Dartmoor Farm. This house here, also at the time, Samuel Barker, that's 300 Horseneck Road. That was an area that that had a burial place and an Indian meeting house at one time. I just want to finish up first. I'll finish up with John Simon, Martha's grandfather. In 1698, so very early on, Reverends Grindal Ross and Samuel Danforth, who they were representing an English missionary society, they wrote a pamphlet called Account of an Indian Visitation, A.D. 1698. And it says, at Dartmouth, we found an assembly of Indians. At Nuckahummies, William Simons, who may be the father of John, William Simons, ordained by Gifford of Martha's Vineyard, who's an historical figure, was a minister out there, 3 years since, is the pastor. Martha's grandfather, John Simon, is also mentioned in several other sources. In fact, I found he was mentioned more than any of the other Indian ministers that I saw. In 1803, he was mentioned by Reverend William Emerson of Boston, who was the father of Ralph Waldo Emerson, who wrote a pamphlet called Notes on Little Compton. And the reason he was writing about Little Compton, his brother-in-law, Reverend May Shepherd, was the congregational minister there. And he says, John Simon was a man of strong mind, prevailingly temperate, but occasionally devious, whose object was the welfare of the Indians, and who thought it right to use cunning in obtaining it. So influential was this Indian preacher that he was made a justice of the peace. And he talks about an episode where John Simon was serving in kind of local court case. Justice of the peace in those days decided minor criminal matters. And there was an Indian who was accused of unspecified crime. And who he calls Colonel Almy, who is Job Almy, said, I think he should get 8 or 10 stripes, meaning blows of the whip. And John Simon said, no, that's too many. The poor Indian is ignorant, doesn't know the law. I think 4 or 5 will be enough. In another case, John Simon's wife was accused, again, of an unspecified crime. I've seen other records involving Almy and his punishment. These would involve some form of drunkenness. And, but anyway, his wife was the defendant. And so Almy didn't say anything. And he deferred to John Simon. He said, what should be her punishment? And John Simon said, she should get double punishment because I know that she is not ignorant. And Almy, who was the presiding justice of the peace, thinking he was doing a favor to John Simon and knowing that he loved his wife, remitted her punishment, basically gave her a warning and let her go. Simon didn't say anything. A few days later, Simon encountered Almy and chewed him out, told him that if they were going to administer justice, you couldn't do it in a way that showed such obvious favoritism. And Emerson wrote, the colonel so poignantly felt the reproach as most cordially to wish that the squaw had been flagellated. I think John Simon probably died. He was at, we'll go through, he was down at Acoxet in Westport. He had probably died by 1763 when his, there's a list of Dartmouth Indians that doesn't include him, though there was a Thomas Simon on that list. The next mention of John Simon comes probably some 50 years after his death in the case of Dartmouth versus Westport, which was in 1813. Westport sued Dartmouth. They were taking care of an Indian woman named Amy Jeffrey, and is quite an elderly woman by that time, and had provided medical treatment, in general, the welfare payments. In those days, the towns took care of that. Most of the town business was in things like arguing with other towns, saying, no, she really shouldn't be taken care of by us, it should be by you. She belongs to such and such a town. And in this case, Dartmouth was claiming that she belonged to Westport. And they took depositions in the case. And one of the witnesses was Eliza White of Westport. Now, this is Elizabeth David White. This is Charlotte White's mother who's giving this testimony. Testify and say that 61 or 62 years ago, I was at a wedding and present when Joseph Jeffrey was married to Amy Hinckley by John Simon, an old Indian minister. And further saith that I had frequently been informed that the grandfather of the above-named Joseph Jeffrey had a real estate in that part of Dartmouth, now called Westport, and was an inhabitant in said Westport and was an Indian minister. Unfortunately, she doesn't say what the name of Joseph Jeffrey's grandfather is, or I'd have another minister. I always understood that the said John Simon was an ordained minister and have been frequently shown the place where he usually baptized those that applied to him for that purpose, and that he administered the sacrament of the Lord's Supper to the members of the church. Another witness was Quash Anthony. Quash is an Ashanti day name in the manner of Cuffy or Piros. He probably was born in Africa, although it doesn't say. It says, testify and say that I lived with William Anthony in the town of Dartmouth. As an aside, I think William Anthony, if it's the same one, is the great-grandfather of Susan B. Anthony. And one Joseph Jeffrey, an Indian man, was a neighbor and lived with Humphrey Smith. And when I was about 17 or 18 years of age, the said Jeffrey invited me to his wedding in Little Compton. And we got to Perez Richmond's, which is a name we've heard before, where Amy Hinckley lived, the person to whom he was to be married. Joseph Jeffrey and Amy Hinckley went to John Simons, the Indian minister, to be married, and myself and another went a different way to buy cakes for the wedding. And we returned nearly at the same time to said Richmond's, where we had the wedding fair. I should point out, when he talks about going to Little Compton, Ocoxet was part of Little Compton until the state line was redrawn 1743, and Little Compton and Tiverton became part of Rhode Island. Question by Abner Brownell. Abner Brownell, longtime town clerk of Westport, and as Tony Connors styles him, the Paul Revere of Westport, who back in Revolutionary days rode through town to tell people about Lexington. Do you know that John Simon, the Indian minister, baptized people and administered the sacraments of the church? Answer, no, I did not, but I have heard him preach. The last witness, William Simon of New Bedford, an Indian man, testify and say that I perfectly recollect my grandfather, John Simon. So this is someone, he must be either Martha's brother or a first cousin. I perfectly recollect my grandfather, John Simon, an Indian minister who lived in the town of Little Compton until near the close of his life, when he removed to the town of Dartmouth, now New Bedford. And until he did remove to this town, his practice was to visit this town and preach as often as once in 3 or 4 weeks. And I've often been present when he administered the ordinances of baptism and the Lord's Supper, and have frequently been present when he married people. Now you might say, well, how come there's no reference to Fairhaven? At the time he makes this deposition, Fairhaven is still part of New Bedford. It hasn't separated as a town yet. That came later. Question, do you know that your grandfather, John Simon, received blankets from Boston for use of the Indians? Answer, yes. So that was the testimony that came from an 1813 case. The other main case that I'm aware of that happened later in 1859 was a claim by a group called Dartmouth, descendants of Dartmouth Indians, claiming parts of what's called extensive tracts of land in the towns of Dartmouth and Westport, embracing the whole or considerable portions of 8 farms in those towns. And this was, the report was made by John Milton Earl. He's the guy who did the Earl Census of Indians just after this. And his job apparently is to report to the legislature and the governor after taking testimony on his findings. The complainants were Asa Weiner, Rodney Weiner, who would be Asa's uncle, and others. And as a group, they are the heirs of Dartmouth Indians who claimed 2 tracts of land, one of them bordering on both sides of Slocum's River in Dartmouth and extending up and down the same about 3 miles. The other tract was on the west side of what they call the West River, the west branch of the Acoxet River in Westport, formerly owned, occupied, and possessed by said Indians, the title whereof, as they affirm, has never been sold, transferred, or alienated by them or their ancestors, and the possession of which they now claim by right of hereditary descent. So in saying who the respondents are, these are the owners, the white guys who own the 8 farms. One of them is Samuel Barker. There are 4 listed on the Dartmouth side. Samuel Barker, John Wing, who we'll see on another map, he's down here. Otis Slocum, who's down here. And they have Nathaniel Gifford, but they've made a mistake. He belongs on the Westport side of the equation. On the Westport side, they have Samuel Brightman, who belongs over here on the Dartmouth side, and Alicia Peckham, Ellery Manchester, and John Dyer. You can go to the next map, and we'll take a look at it.
Next slide.
Yeah, next slide, Bob. This is Acoxet. This is the area where John Simon had his meeting house, right up here. Acoxet Chapel is over here, where the meeting house, and there was an Indian cemetery right in here. 601 Old Harbor Road is the address. But for the land claims, you'll see here, E. Manchester, that's Ellery Manchester. That's one of the defendants, as it were. In this case, Alicia Peckham is right up here. We're going to see in the next map, I think, over here we'll see Nathaniel Gifford and John Dyer, who are over on the Little Compton side. The Perez Richmond, remember, Perez, this is back 100 years before this map, lived in the house marked A. Manchester. That house was built about 1740. That's Abraham Manchester. And for those wondering about the Adamsville connection, the Abraham Manchester who had the store, later the restaurant, that's the grandson of this Abraham Manchester. Next slide. This is Little Compton in 1850, the eastern side of Little Compton. This is John Dyer Road running up here. The Native American Meeting House is just north of this house marked Nathaniel Gifford, which is still in existence. That's 178 John Dyer. I think what's called Meeting House Meadow is the area where the parking lot is for, if any of you have been to Simmons Mill Preserve, which is this whole area in here. It's the John Dyer Road parking lot. Now let me tell you a little bit why I've come to that conclusion. Rawson and Danforth, who I mentioned before, in their 1698 survey, says in Little Compton they found plantations of Indians who keep 2 distinct assemblies for the worship of God. And I think he's referring to the one over here in Little Compton. The one in Acoxet that we just saw is right around here. This map is only in Little Compton, so it doesn't extend into Westport, but they're pretty close. I'd say maybe 1.5 miles or so in one from the other. The first assembly dwells at Saconnet. That's this one. Samuel Church, alias Sauchawaham, has for more than 1 year past endeavored their instruction, and is the best capable of any in the place to perform that service. He has ordinarily 40 auditors, many people in the audience, and often many times more. Of these, over 20 are men. Several here are well instructed in their catechism, and above 10 can read the Bible. Here are likewise 2 Indian rulers, John Tokuquanu and Jonathan George, the first of which is a man well spoken of. I gave a lecture here on the origins of Watuppa, and 2 of the original lot owners at Watuppa were Old Sam Church, who was the de facto minister here, and Jonathan George. Jonathan George is probably either the same person or the son of a Sakana Indian who's called Honest George in Benjamin Church's memoirs. Although if that's Honest George, obviously his stock has gone down because he is relatively not well spoken of. Now, the next reference is written almost 200 years later. This is on Bale's History of Newport County, which was 1888. Northeast of Potter's Corners, on the farm of George H. Gifford, that's George Hussey Gifford, who was Nathaniel's son. Nathaniel was dead by the time Bales was written, is the grave of Aaron Succonash, who, with his wife Mary, lived there since the place has been owned by the Gifford family, which was probably a long, long time. The site of his house, Succonash's house and grave, are a few rods south of Mr. Gifford's and on the east side of the highway. So down, basically, in this area down here. The field, now a meadow, contained also the wigwam of Wayner, an Indian who married Mary White. Their son Rodney, a man of remarkable physique, was a whaler, remembered by persons now living. Now, Rodney Wayner, he's one of the claimants in that case brought to John Milton Earl. Genealogically, I won't get into it. There's some confusion here. Mary White was his mother, Mary Amos White. But I think they've got the grandfather of, the Wayner grandfather of Rodney mixed up for the father. But anyway, I'll leave that aside. Bales goes on. North from Mr. Gifford's house, a few rods, in a field still known as Meeting House Meadow, stood the place of worship where religious meetings were held by the Indians. During Reverend Billings' pastorate of the Congregational Church, he frequently instructed the little congregation of Indians in this building. Now, Billings' pastorate lasted from 1704 to 1748. And if you read the entry for him in Little Compton Families by Benjamin Franklin Wilbur, it says, filled with missionary zeal and an interest in medicine, he, meaning Billings, seems to have been much beloved by his own people as well as by the Indians of the region. So there seems to be some merit to that. Now, back to Bales and his account. West of Meeting House Meadow once lived Jehu, Jehu, the Indian minister, and his daughter, Alice. He was buried at that place. So Jehu, I think, was, remember, this is the place where originally they had Samuel Church, who kind of was the de facto pastor, and then Billings may have taken it over for a while. I think Jehu probably came in the era that was a little after him. In 1771, there's town records in Little Compton. Sarah Jehu and her daughter Alice were given doctoring by Benjamin Richmond, and food and supplies by their neighbor, Canaan Gifford. Canaan Gifford was the father of Nathaniel and probably the guy who built the house. In 1772, I mentioned before how these towns were all, and those two, Richmond and Gifford, were reimbursed 16 pounds. In 1772, the town meeting voted that Sarah Jehu and her daughter return of money into the town treasury that was paid for them between this and April next, or to be bound out to service to pay ye same by the proper authority. So they're saying, you got these payments for your support. If you don't pay the town back, you're going to take and be bound out. They're going to be essentially sold out as indentured servants to work off the amount they owed the town. Sarah repaid the money, so somehow came up with it. But after she died, her daughter Alice did end up a ward of the town and was bound out to various families. After Jehu's time, there's a number of references in one of Bob's favorite books, Peleg Burrows' journal. Peleg Burrows was a Baptist minister at what we know as Old Stone Baptist Church. And he did a lot of work with local people of color. His era was basically from around the time of the Revolution up through the 1790s. And there's a number of instances where he said he preached at the Indian meeting house. And I think this is the one that he met. So probably after Jehu's time, Burroughs probably took over.
Richard, is the Old Stone Church up in the top of that? Is that right up just in Tivoli?
Yeah, it should be, where it says Baptist Church, right here. That's the Old Stone Church. Yeah, so not that far. And that's where Burroughs lived. He lived in a parsonage right next to it, so it wouldn't be far for him to go down John Dyer Road. Also from Bale's History of Newport County, kind of a curious item. But he was talking about this area. He said on the farm of William Taylor Simmons. It was over here. Where's his house? Where is it? Over here. Along highway, but his farm extended this way. They said there was an Indian trail that led across his farm to the east, and that there was an Indian burial ground on the trail, and that they exhumed a skeleton of a man who was 8 feet tall. And they took the skull and they sent it to Fowler and Wells in New York City, which was kind of like a private museum that was interested in phrenology, which some people were very interested in the day, and so it was displayed there apparently if you would have gone to New York City in 1888. So it is consistent, though, with the idea that there was not only a meeting house in this area, but that in this general area there was probably a settlement of Indians.
There was another 8-foot man found on Route 44 near the Taunton River. He was buried there when they put Route 44 in. They found an 8-foot man also. Oh, well,
it could have gotten together and made a good beginning of a good basketball team right there. Let's see. Next, here we are back at Russell's Mills. You see, here's Samuel Barker over there. This house here, which is 300 Horseneck Road, that's William White Gifford, who was Samuel Barker's son-in-law. I don't see a deed from Barker to Gifford for that property, but he was just living with him. Barker owned a lot of land. Barker owned like 400 acres in this whole area. Down here you see another one of the farms that was claimed as Indian land, John Wing, these two houses here. This one here is 503 Horseneck. The north one is no longer in existence. I think it might be. There's an old cellar just over the wall from Dartmoor Farm on DNRT property. Otis Slocum, who was also mentioned, is down here, the north section of Barney's Joy. Keeping that in mind, This is from the testimony in 1859 that John Milton Earl took. Marlborough Wood, 91 years of age. He was a white man. In 1850, Marlborough Wood was living with his son Stephen in the house that's right next door to us here. But he said, "In childhood and youth, I knew large numbers of Indians who occupied lands in this town. On both sides of Slocum's River, great numbers resided, had their wigwams, and improved their lands as cornfields and used the lands for hunting and fishing grounds. From nearly a mile south of Otis Slocum's, which would put us down almost into the area where, Demarest Lloyd is, down there towards the end of Barney's Joy Road. All along the shore, on the west side of the river, they lived, had their wigwams and burial grounds, none of which were ever enclosed by them, meaning walled off. On Samuel Barker's farm was the orchard of Nehemiah Abel, the Indian minister, and his residence, which place I frequently visited. Nehemiah I remember well. He was distinguished as an Indian minister, and his place was much visited. The Indians came over once a year to his place from the vineyard and other places to hold a sacrament. Nehemiah Abel was Paul Cuffey's father-in-law. His daughter Alice was Paul's wife. Marlborough Wood goes on. Asa F. Wayner's grandfather, Michael Wayner, lived and owned the place where Mr. Charles Tucker's house stand. His dwelling was on the same place. That was down on that triangle of land where Duval's is, just past where the store is. John Wayner's grandfather lived, occupied, and owned the land on the west side of the Westport River. I was quite an old man and had been married some time when he died. He occupied the land till his death. The next witness, Samuel Wilcox, was 88 years of age. Again, this is another white man, born and lived in Westport. He lived on Horseneck Road in Westport. I knew in my early years of Indian lands and Indians occupying them in Dartmouth. From north of Samuel Barker's, all along the shore, including 2 burial grounds. Particularly do I remember Nehemiah's place, his orchard and farm. From his orchard I have taken apples. He was celebrated as an Indian minister. The place now occupied by John Wing, which is down here, the north part of which was an Indian settlement called Quanachie, so in the area of Dartmoor Farm he's referring to. This was within my memory. I'm not sure if there were 1 or 2 Nehemiah Abels. The record of a Nehemiah Abel in Dartmouth goes way, way back. He was paid by the Commonwealth in 1712 and 1713 as an Indian justice. So it sounds something like what John Simon was. And for also teaching on Slocum's Island, which I'm not sure, that's probably either Nashawina or Cuttyhunt. Slocum's on both those islands. He was paid for teaching school at Little Compton in 1734. So he's not teaching white children. This is being paid by the state. The state administered what few programs there were for education of Native Americans at the time. In 1767, an allowance was given to Nehemiah Abel of Dartmouth, who was called a minister of the Baptist persuasion. His wife was Naomi Quantz, whose family also came from that same area. In the contemporary records, Bristol County Court records in 1774, Naomi Abel, Indian woman, sued Isaac Spooner of Dartmouth, gentleman, a deputy sheriff, for assault and imprisonment, false imprisonment, presumably, claimed 100 pounds in damages. From Peleg Burrows' journal, I mentioned Burrows in connection with the Little Compton meeting. An aged woman named Naomi Quantz desired to be received as a member with us, and after examination was received. It says in parentheses, he said in parentheses, she was baptized by an Indian minister years ago. Well, that would be her husband who baptized her. Naomi Quantz, and I've seen several instances of this, clearly she was probably a widow, almost certainly a widow by this time. For some reason, the Native American women would very often, after they became a widow, would revert to their maiden name. And I've seen several instances of that, in the way that women often do now if they get divorced, revert to their maiden name. But I don't know why or what purpose that served, but I've seen a number of instances of it. A bunch of relatives, by the way, of the Cuffey family, for example, in Westport, they were associated with that Baptist church in Adamsville, usually after the era where Peleg Burrows was the minister. But Paul's wife, Alice, who was Nehemiah Abel's daughter, was baptized there. Shalati White was associated with that. John Cuffey's wife, who was Shalati's sister, was a member over there. And they had quite a few from Westport of the Cuffey family who were associated with that church. Getting back to the 1859 testimony, the next witness was Mary Nobbs. I was born in Westport. I am of Indian descent. My grandmother was Naomi Abel, and my great-grandmother was Alice Quantz. Alice was pure Indian and spoke the Indian language. They lived to the westward of John Wing's. There's John Wing. Now, I happen to know, because this area here was actually the farm where my mother grew up, so I know something about the land records. John Wing's farm essentially extended up into throughout this area here. So over by Division Road, I think is where it's being referred to. My grandmother and great-grandmother lived a mile or a mile and a half to the northwest of Slocum's River. Cross-examined. I am 64 years old. My mother died about 39 years ago. My grandmother died when I was a girl, before I was grown up. I recollect my great-grandmother. My grandmother took care of her. My father's name was Paul Cuffey. This is Mary Cuffey Phelps Knob. She had remarried. Her first husband died in a shipwreck. The next witness was Alice Cook, who was Mary's sister. I remember when some of the Indians lived by Slocum's River on the west side some 60 years ago. I am 68 years of age. One of the Indians was Lizzie Prince, and one was Betty Nuxu. The next witness was Charlotte Smith, who is the sister-in-law of Alice, who was married to Captain Pardon Cook. Charlotte was a cook. She was Pardon's sister. I am the daughter of Benjamin and Catherine Cook. My mother was pure Indian. My father was half. My grandmother was Mary Cook. Her maiden name was Robbins, by the way, which is in Tiverton Vital Records. And my great-grandmother was Elizabeth Nuxu. They spell it here, N-U-X-U. When I see it in the Vital Records, it's usually like Nunksu, N-U-N-K-S-U-E, or something similar. They were pure Indians. I presume they were part of the tribe that lived by Slocums, by which they mean Otis Slocum, down here around Great Neck. There was an Indian burying ground between Samuel Barker's and the river. So up in here, where indeed it's been in the 1930s, I think it was discovered by a farmer plowing up his fields. There was an Indian settlement at Quanachie and one at Quonset, which is the area over towards north of Allen's Pond, Bald Hill area, around where the Allen's Neck Meeting House is. Cross-examination. I have not personally known of the burial of any Indian at the burial grounds. I have not known of any Indian residing within a mile of Slocum's or Wings. I knew Elizabeth Prince living at Bald Hill, which is down by the Allen's Neck Meeting House. Next witness was Deborah C. Borden. She's the sister of Charlotte. It doesn't say her, but her husband, she lived in New Bedford. Her husband, Nathaniel A. Borden, ran for state representative in Massachusetts in 1842, and as far as I can determine, is the first person of color to run for any state elective office. Frederick Douglass had just arrived in New Bedford, and he cast his first vote for her husband. And in those days, he had to pay, I think it was $1.50 poll tax to vote, so it was painful to vote in those days. He says, I am the daughter of Catherine Cook. My great-grandmother was buried in the burying ground on Otis Slocum's farm and lived and died near there, so down around Great Neck. She had a wigwam there, and it was the last one there. I never visited her there. I was quite young. Cross-examination. My great-grandmother was buried there, as my mother told me. She died in 1812. I am 50 years old. My testimony in relation to my grandmother is founded on information given by my mother. The redirect, I have visited the ground. My mother told me where my grandmother laid. The next witness was John Wayner. This would be Rodney's half-brother, Ace's uncle. I reside in Westport. I remember my grandmother. Her name was Margaret Quevin. She was a full-blooded Indian. She lived part of the time in Dartmouth and part of the time in Westport. She lived about 1.5 miles west of Slocum's River in Dartmouth, near where Naomi Quantz lived. My great-grandmother was Dorcas Quevin. She was reputed to have lived down by Slocum's. And where his grandmother lived, I think it's in this area, over towards Division Road. It's more or less near, if you know where the parking lot is for the Mass Wildlife property in here. It's somewhere pretty close to there. I've seen in deeds among the Brightmans from, I think, 1830s, 1840s, a 12-acre piece which is called Naomi's Place. And I think that's probably where Naomi Quantz Abel, and before that, likely her husband, Nehemiah Abel, lived. Somebody asked me once, well, how come, these people of color were just living on this property? How come they weren't, evicted or anything? Well, way back in the day, to start with, Peleg Slocum, God, he had way over 1,000 acres just in here, and another 150 acres over that side, and another 150 acres kitty corner down here. He had plenty of land. He needed labor, for some of which was supplied by slaves, and others were supplied probably by people who he just allowed to build their wigwams or small houses on his property, and probably in exchange just gave him some farm labor. When you had the acreage they didn't worry too much about sharing it. The last witness in the Dartmouth Indian land claims, Charles Manchester. I am 68 years of age. He's a white man. I recollect the mother and grandmother of Rodney Wayner and where they lived. The grandmother lived on land recently occupied by Abraham Manchester, about a mile from the sea and near a mile from the West River. Well, if we can go to the next map, I think that's on there. Oh, no, we'll stop here for a minute. This is a slightly later map of Old Dartmouth. Samuel Barker here. This is his son-in-law, William White Gifford. That's 300 Horseneck Road there. By now, John Wing just has the one house, has 503 Horseneck. The old house, which I think was Holder Slocum's house back in the day, no longer shown. We can go to the next map. Here we are down here. So this Abraham Manchester, which is the old Perez Richmond farm, and Charles Manchester, who's living right up here, where Ellery Manchester used to live, is the witness, and he's telling us that Rodney Wayner's grandmother occupied that land. And he says about a mile from the sea and near a mile from West River. So a mile from the sea in this direction and from the Westport River, which is probably roughly right. About a mile further north, near the river, an Indian lived named Jacob Howdy. So somewhere up in here. It might be 30 years since, so 1830, let's say, more or less. Rodney's mother lived a little way across the line in Rhode Island. And if you go across the line, up from where Jacob Howdy lived, you're getting into that area where the Little Compton meeting house was. Next. This is the house, is 178 John Dyer Road. Attributed to Nathaniel Gifford. Nathaniel wasn't even born when this house was built. It was built by Canaan Gifford, his father. It's where George Hussey Gifford lived. The Indian meeting house is described in 1888 as being a few rods north of this house. Next. Here we are back in Dartmouth a few years later. There's Bob's Corey Reed house there, and then they've got the name, they've got Parker instead of Barker. It should be Paul Barker by that time. William White Gifford apparently had moved out, but again, this is the area begins up here and goes south and extends over where A. Brightman, that's where Samuel Brightman had lived. So the area being claimed is starting on the north line up around here, extending in this area quite a bit west, probably almost all the way over to Division Road, and unspecified how wide, in other words, east to west, they were claiming. It was 3 miles from north to south, so it was quite a bit of property that they were claiming as Indian land. Next, here's 1871 Westport. Here, conveniently, Old Indian Burying Ground, which is written on the map. It's just to the east of the brook. Now, on this map, the brook is called Simmons Brook, and there is a Simmons that lives nearby. In most modern maps that I've looked at, street atlases and such, they call that Simon's Brook, and that may be a leftover from the days when old John Simon was the minister, and presumably the meeting house, which would have been long gone by this time, but the meeting house presumably would have been in proximity to the cemetery, just like white people did with their churches, having them close to the cemetery. This is the A. Manchester, which is the old Perez Richmond house down there. It's Charles Manchester, one of the former Ellery Manchester house, which is part of the land being claimed that was located in Westport. Here's Alice Cook, Paul Cuffey's daughter, was one of the witnesses. That's the house she lived in. That's over on Drift Road in Westport. That's Benjamin P. Cook, who was her son. Alice had died, I guess, by this time. And you look back in the old deeds of Akoksett is kind of unusual. This area, this is the only part of Old Dartmouth that I can think of that was not part of the Dartmouth propriety. I mean, when they did that, it was part of Little Compton. It was part of a separate town. So, and when the Sakonnet proprietors, they had a little bit of a similar situation where they were buying land from Indians, but they bought this land down here from Mamawa, but it was the chief, but he never sold all of it. He never sold lock, stock, and barrel. He was cagey. He sold it piece by piece, and he would sell him a little piece up here. He sold all of his stepmother was a Washunks, who was head of the band over in Little Compton. He gave them a deed for all her land because he didn't care. He was a rival. A Washunks that had him kidnapped and beaten up one time, so he was no friend of hers. And so he sold his stepmother group's land, lock, stock, and barrel, pretty much over in the Little Compton side. But his people he sold piece by piece and retreated. He also gave, which is also unusual for anywhere else in Old Dartmouth, there's a number of deeds that Mamawa gave to other Indians, not to white men. So he gave, for example, and it would be somewhere up in here, to an Indian named Howdy. And we know from the testimony, and much later, there's a Jacob Howdy who was living up in here. One of the Indians who lived right in this area and owned land here was Alderman. Alderman was a soldier with Benjamin Church during King Philip's War. He is the man who shot King Philip. And he made a kind of a speech over the body in which he says, well, you were a great warrior in your time, but I'm going to chop your ass for you now. In those days, they were drawn and quartered, which it sounds very uncivilized, but remember, back in England, in the English Civil Wars, they were doing the exact same thing. And Alderman, as a trophy, Benjamin Church let him have Philip's hand, which was distinctive and scarred because a pistol had misfired in Philip's hand and left a big scar. And he took the hand and he preserved it in a tub of rum, and he would exhibit it, and he would charge people to look at it. And I guess people were willing to pay a pence or whatever to go look at it. And Church is almost envious when he writes about it. He says he made much money by going around and exhibiting King Philip's hand. But he lived, I think, in the area right in here, right just a little bit to the north of where or to the east, I should say, east of where the burial ground was. Next slide. This is 1895 in Dartmouth. Here you can get a sense of kind of the whole scope. So this is, this is Otis Slocum's house. That house is still in existence. I don't know the number on Barney's Joy Road. If you go down, it's on the left-hand side. Very imposing 2.5-story Georgian, set back from the road somewhat. That's his son, Jonathan Slocum. By that time, Otis Slocum owned all this area in here. So the area being claimed in 1859, where's Barker? This is Paul Barker Estate. So somewhere around in here, by the river, down to a mile south of this house, so probably pretty much all the way down in here. And as I said, up to the north, there's still a Brightman living over here. Quite a bit to the, it was part of the old Samuel Brightman farm, which would be over in that area there, almost to Division Road. So they don't say, nowhere in the records do I see, how many acres it was in total that were being claimed, but it was quite a piece. I wouldn't mind. It's not something you'd mind owning. Next, this is 1895 map of Westport. You see the Coxa Chapel is there now, or was there between 1871 and this map. Phobes W. Manchester is the owner of the old Abraham Manchester, which was the old Perez Richmond house. The cemetery would have been located right in that area, and as I said, the meeting house is reasonably to presume was pretty close to where the cemetery is. Next. I think that's it. Okay, so, well, that's it. Does anybody have any questions? I'd be happy